Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. In this weekly podcast, Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
Hello and welcome to Magic in the Room. I'm Chris Province.
And I'm Luke Freeman. And today we are super excited to be joined by Dr. Brigitte Steinheider, one of our favorite people in the world. The person who, facilitated Chris and I and Hannah as well, connecting with each other in meaningful ways. And wow, here we are 12 years later. So we'll talk about all of that. But first, introduction. So Dr. Steinheider is the Associate Professor of Psychology for the Organizational Dynamics program at the University of Oklahoma. She earned her MBA in 1992 from University of Dusseldorf and her PhD in psychology from the University of Technology, Dresden in 1996. Her research focuses on collaborative leadership as well as interdisciplinary collaborations and knowledge integration in corporate R&D teams and academic settings. And I will attest to all of that. I mean, when we think about what you might have heard to us refer to as ODINE on the podcast, this organizational dynamics program, I mean, that's what it is. Knowledge integration, interdisciplinary collaboration. So really taking that expertise and applying it to this program. She has consulted for a variety of international organizations such as Volkswagen, Bosch, and Daimler-Benz. Did I say it right?
Perfect,
Daimler.
Perfect.
I said Daimler as we were practicing, and that was incorrect. So you might have figured out that Dr. Steinheider is native of Germany, but has been in the States with us for 20 years. Is that right? Or
More
longer?
than that. I came 3 weeks before 9/11.
Oh, wow. What a formative first experience.
Yes, it was.
Interesting. Man, we could do a whole episode on that.
Sure.
Okay. Well, what did I miss? What did I leave out? What should people know that is most important about your work before we jump into our conversation today?
I think you summarized it pretty well. So yeah, I've been here in Oklahoma since 20 years. So I came in 2002 to implement the ODINE program. And that has very much been my life, more or less, since then. So,
yeah. Well, I know, my memory from a dozen years ago is I had been looking for something to challenge me, something to develop me. The place I was at professionally, I didn't have like a job change or opportunity on the horizon, but I wanted to do something to keep from going crazy and my brain just continuing to get me in trouble, coming up with ideas that were dumb, and was like, well, maybe I should just learn some instead. So I looked at all of these programs at MBAs and do I do something online, and chose the ODINE program. And I remember walking into class. I mean, I didn't have a lot of money at the time. And I was like, this is a large investment for me. And, I'm going to be away from my family. And I had 3 small kids, or actually just 2, I think, when we started the program, and adopted our 3rd partway through the program. So there's lots of like life stuff happening, and was in Tulsa for a lot of, that 2.5, 3 years of the program. And so I walk into class, and I think my first class might have been Teams and Motivation, which to this day is, I don't know if it's my favorite class. Psychology of Leadership was one of the courses, and I love that as well. But this idea of how do we create teams that are effective? How do we tap into intrinsic motivation in folks? It just wasn't long at all before I was just completely sold and bought in, and loved those weekends over on the OU Tulsa campus, and loved connecting with the people who were there. And anytime it was one of Dr. Steinheider's courses, I was like, yes, I know this is going to be a great one. So just looking forward to like the engagement. And I went on and I adjunct taught a couple classes at sort of the local university near where I lived. And I took all of my class modeling, quiz on the reading, at the beginning of every class, just all of these things that you do, and try to apply them, because to me it worked so beautifully. So you're a master of your craft. So anyway, that's my real introduction, I guess, is I'm very excited to get to spend some time today.
Yeah, same. And I remember, I talk a lot about, Bob Schooley was really like my first coach, and going through high potential programs with Bob. He was leading a cohort, and I think I was halfway through our second cohort in that program, and he just looked at me one day. He's like, "Man, you're only going to get so much out of airport readers, right? Like at some point, like the direction you want to go, like you're going to find that like in actual research as part of a university program. I've got someone that I'd like to introduce you to." And that's when Bob introduced me to Dr. Steinheider. And yeah, I mean, it was a whole life-changing experience for me, like getting to, and I say getting to because I'm grateful for it, to like dig into the actual research that shows up in 40 different ways across, 40 different authors out there in the airport reader world. There's a, very small batch of empirical research that's feeding a lot of those interpretations, and getting access to that knowledge was critical, and that was great. But more so, getting a 2.5, maybe 3-year education on like how to facilitate, how to create a place where people can belong. And, you were such a steward of that program. And I remember, Jason Day and all of us being at the Brook, I think after our first class, and we were talking about like what was the spirit of this program. And I think Jason spoke the words of like, well, it's kind of like a program for people looking for something but can't find it. Like this is where they find it. But I think what he was speaking to is like, man, this is where people that want to know things about leadership can belong, and not feel like outcast or, this is our nerdery. We can talk about leadership however we choose, and having an environment to do that safely and explore weird ideas, a lot of times, and maybe even go down the research path with those. So, so from that first meeting, kind of diving into the program, but really not just the books, but that community-based education, the double loop feedback, kind of that socio-moral climate, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, that you facilitate into that space that allows people to grow and develop. Like ultimately, that's what we aim to try to take to organizations today. So thank you so much for that. And that's the story of me first having that opportunity. So thank you so much.
You raised so many points, I don't even know where to start. So first of all, I'm of course extremely pleased, to hear that you find the methodologies I used, beneficial, and then also that you implement them afterwards, so that's of course the biggest compliment. So I remember, Chris, you said, if companies would know what's already out there in research, they could be so much more successful. So that still stayed with me. And I mean, you also practiced it very successfully. Airport literature, by the way, is not as bad maybe as its reputation, because what they actually do is they take only one concept maybe of leadership or change or any others, and then they kind of like implement it in a story. So the difference into academic research is really more that our models are a little bit more complex.
Sure.
So that kind of like, and of course the language also is a little bit different.
Much more consumable when I lift it up at, Denver International versus, out of the library. So.
Well, I think, the interesting thing as you were sharing about the airport readers is they're doing what we do, but we do it for a specific organization.
Right.
And so they're essentially saying, here's some themes from the literature, from research, and let's lift some and try and make them a little bit more digestible and create some principles around them. And I think that's great for, the folks at the middle of the bell curve. But, having the power, and this is what Odine did for me, having the power to go to the source material, and then I get to be the mediator. I get to say, this correlation is especially strong in this model. This case study is especially related to the organization that I'm working for. Let's pull those. And now my job is to create the digestible talking points, teaching points, so that they can implement those best practices for them in a way that suits them. Because what the airport readers don't do is say, here's the developmental stages of organizations, and this principle applies to you in one way here when you're a $50 million organization, and another way when you're a $500 million organization. It's going to show up differently when you think about knowledge management or when you think about collaboration. So yeah, I wouldn't have that power if it weren't for Odyne to be able to read a correlation table and, be able to take really what is true about science of organizational psychology, organizational performance, and turn it into something that, a founder with 50 employees can find really useful and really actionable.
Right. And, going into the organizational dynamics program, I'd only experienced learning one way. And that was like, read the book, show up for class, professor lectures. I go home and read more book. I show up for class again, the professor lectures. This is really the first time I'd been exposed to team-based learning. And I think this is a great opportunity to share kind of what that concept is, the importance of those double loops, and like what happens in that environment, and how do you, I don't know, it feels like that's where all the community and belonging and so much other good stuff is seeded from. But can you just share a little bit about kind of what traditional learning has looked like, why you decided to say team-based is best for this, and what that's emerged for the program?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, look, in the beginning, what you left out is I also have a master's in psychology. And actually I studied also in Düsseldorf. And that was kind of like a highly scientific program. It was kind of like an experimental program and really geared towards preparing us to be researchers. And it was exactly like you said, come to class, listen to a lecture, read the books, do the tests, and so on and so on. And when I was at the end of the program, I had no clue however I could make money with it. I knew that I didn't want to become a clinical psychologist, but I had no idea, how I could translate what I had learned then into any kind of like profession. So when I did my internships then at an advertisement company, Gray, and I was in market research. And that was something I could relate to and I liked. And they also offered me a job. But I still had to do my thesis. So I went back then, and did my thesis then, and fell in love with research, and my life took then a very different trajectory.
Yeah. So finish that story. I mean, how did you get from there to helping to create this Odyne program and what you've focused on the last couple decades?
So I was then in academia. I mean, I was at the University of Dresden for a couple of years, and then I went to the Fraunhofer Institute for Industrial Engineering. So Fraunhofer is a huge research organization with more than 80 institutes all over the world. Most of the research is also grant-based, so you apply for it. And most of the research is also done with organizations. So we took innovative concepts, business concepts, applied them together with companies, and then we wrote about it. So I was in the lead in a big multi-million-dollar project there with 10 companies, and I was on service engineering. And so basically what I did was then, I visited with the companies, similar what you do in consulting, so it was kind of like doing the workshops with them, kind of like collecting data and helping them to develop then service products. Mm-hmm. And then I brought all of these companies together then, and then we did workshops. So I always kind of like benchmarking processes, learning from the best. And so this was kind of like a very active learning approach, and we also read and Peter Senge and so on. So from there, then I got a fellowship at UC Santa Barbara. This is how I even came then to the US. Mm-hmm. And during that time, just out of fun, I applied to positions because I already had tenure in Germany. And nothing really came up, I had a job interview in Duluth, Minnesota. I couldn't really imagine going there, I gave lots of talks. So in that way, it was positive. So I went back to Germany. And a month later, I got a phone call from the University of Oklahoma. And they said, we do have a very innovative program here. We cannot find anybody in the US to implement it. Would you be willing to come and interview? So a month after my fellowship, I was back in the US. I interviewed, I think it was 5 days, 2 cities. I think I met about 50 people and they all had to vote on me. I met even with industry. So Williams was very influential also in getting the program started. And they also interviewed me. Greg Robertson, by the way, was one of my interviewers. And and then they kind of like offered me the position. And I just thought it was such an innovative program. And I thought, it contained everything I believed in. And so I thought, okay, if I don't do it now, I'm always going to regret it. So I quit my job, and then came to Tulsa. So the issue was a little bit, so this program was really implemented or initiated by the telecommunication industry, because at that time, Tulsa was a world capital of telecommunication. About 20,000 jobs in the Tulsa community, big companies, Wiltel, Williams, and so on, And they were all so fast growing so that they needed then, to kind of like develop their leadership. And so that's it, because they did not want to just have, most of them were computer scientists. And so they said, so we also need to teach them now some people and leadership skills. And so they approached then the dean of OU Tulsa, and he gave it then, to the psychology department and not to the business school, because industry also said, we want to have people leaders, not bean counters. Bean counters is always a little bit derogative, for MBAs. And so basically then what the university did, they kind of like put the program together and a list then with all the courses, whereas industry then kind of like made a list of their needs. And then, they kind of like compared both, and so that it was a good fit. So that's also then why the program is more interdisciplinary, with aspects of it which are more business school and other parts which are more IO, industrial organizational psychology. So when I came in August, meanwhile, the bubble had burst, and 20,000 people had lost their jobs. So that was the second highest job loss in the US.
Wow.
And so here I had quit my job, at my prestigious research institution, and I was with a program which was geared towards an industry which almost didn't exist anymore. And so one of the first things then what I did was, I thought, okay, we have to open it up now to all industries, so to have more diversity and so that you can really learn then from the best in any area. So, and so then the university also let me teach then a PhD class. So because they thought, to give me some experience, because I'd never taught in the US. And so when I walked into the classroom, and it was a cohort model and they were extremely cohesive. So with the result, they wouldn't listen to me at all. They had kind of like interesting discussions among themselves and completely ignored me. Now I was there with all my slides, and kind of like very well prepared. But they were not interested because this was the last class in their program. So this was weekend number 1, and I was pretty devastated. Weekend number 2 didn't go any better, even though I was even more prepared. I walked to the dean and I told him, I really cannot teach this alone. I need to team teach. And he said, we can do that, but that's a problem. And so I just thought about how can I do it differently? And what I figured out then was, all the students in the class had kind of like high level jobs, like VP of strategic planning for a major company and so on. So and I thought they're all really good in talking, but let's see, whether they're also good in doing. And so I put them, number 1, I put them in teams. Number 2, I gave them problems and projects to solve, then they had to present it. And I also told them that by the end of the weekend, a jury would come in and evaluate them. And that got their attention.
It worked.
It worked. Yeah. And from there on, after the class, I was also then on many of the PhD committees of these students, So then after the class, I went down then to Norman, to the director there of learning and development, and kind of like redesigned the class and doing the whole thing in a more systematic approach. And so what I'm using then is called team-based learning, which was also then developed at OU by a business professor. And basically he did not want to lecture anymore because, he saw, how the attention span and the activity level really went down. So you kind of like, that's then the way to separate then, learning then the content or reading about the content and then applying them. There's a heavy focus then on application.
the team-based learning, and I think there was a lot of folks in our cohort that kind of took this back to their organizations and started implementing this, whether someone is in training and development or was just developing their own internal team that they led. And, I can't think of a story where it didn't lead to higher performance, some level of success for that team or marked improvement. What are the next challenges that a program like this can address?
So, and both of you mentioned already then the kind of climate we have in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, what I really want to do in the classroom is kind of create then a safe climate where everybody can try out new behaviors, without being worried about the outcome of that. So that's really important. And so we call it also an Odine family, because to me, it's like with family, you have all kinds of relatives, and you may agree with them or maybe not so much, and you like some of them better than others, but still there's something that binds you together. And this is my view then of having the diversity in the classroom. And we have pretty high diversity, but then still kind of like integrating that and making sure then also that teams really learn, how to capitalize on their diversity and not kind of being mired then in conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the whole program for me is, yes, of course, we teach theories, concepts, stuff like that, but it's really more about, learning how to learn and then also learning how to apply what you know or what you learned then together with others in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
And a lot of times you don't get to pick your family and you don't get to pick your teams.
Yeah.
So
in my classes, never.
Right.
Because it's also, it's a workplace. You don't pick your team, and you can be on a bad team for years, and whereas in the class, it's only for 2.5 weeks,
Right.
Yeah. And that sparked for me just one of the kind of crucible moments in my experience was I was on a team with a really difficult person. And this was towards the end of the program. And I had gotten pretty comfortable with like being the facilitator, being the creative on the team. And usually with rational, nice teammates, that worked really well. And I could kind of use my facilitative approach to get what I wanted. And, I also really wanted to have the best presentation, best final project for every class. So, I was kind of competitive. I was like, we're going to be the best, but I could do it through like where I was comfortable leadership behavior wise. But man, I remember this one where that approach was not going to work. We were going to fail. We were going to have the worst presentation in the class. And I was maybe going to get a B, and I really didn't want to do that. I wanted to not get any Bs. And that kind of, we could go down a whole performance versus learning orientation and my issues there. But I remember just really being put into this space where I had to do performance management with a teammate that I had no hierarchical power. I had no legitimate power in that situation to make them do anything, but still had to move into a performance, management role with them, provide pretty direct feedback, and be more directive to the team, right? Because no one else was going to do that on the team with this team member. And so then that forced me to be more directive than I typically am. And for me, coming out of that, and I don't remember out of the 4, projects at the end, I don't think we were the best, but it was a lot better than I thought it was going to be, 2 weeks earlier. And so finding success, using different leadership behaviors, using different leadership approaches, being put in those positions, I think is kind of what the program's all about. And in a lot of ways, how do we gain knowledge, but then how do we also really apply it in real time and build skills that are transferable in real time back to whatever our work setting is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the approach. So I just finished teaching a class on teams and motivation. And you saw the final results.
Mm-hmm.
And,
we were on the jury. Yeah. We were one of the dreaded juries, although they didn't seem very scared of us.
Oh, no. And you were a wonderful jury. So it's really kind of like your experience being on a team, so you journal also about it, so kind of like analyzing your observations. And then at the end, you write a paper about it, where you also analyze then your team. And so meanwhile, you also have gotten then feedback on the presentation. So there's also some outside evaluation. And then you also get feedback then from your peers. So that basically, you get, it's kind of like 360 feedback, more or less, And so you get this type of feedback in every class. So meaning also you can experience yourself always on different teams, and having then different roles. So and I think that is very beneficial for learning.
And I think the approach really gets people comfortable being uncomfortable. Whether you're uncomfortable giving feedback, you're challenged to do that every time you're on a team. If you're uncomfortable receiving feedback, you're challenged to do that every time you're on a team. And then something, in that world, like you are our senior leader. And at the end of every weekend, you say, what are you taking with you? What went well? What could I do better? And modeling that, like, hey, I'm responsible for facilitating this environment, this climate. What needs to be better in this space the next time we're together? Not one class from now, not next month, not next semester. Like next time we're together, what needs to be better? And I think seeing that modeled, definitely it's admirable because it is terrifying, for someone like me, but to see it modeled, it says, okay, she did it and didn't die. I'll probably be okay if I ask the same question. So it's kind of, you speak to some of those other things about giving and getting feedback, experiencing yourself on a team. There's just so much power in finding ways to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And we only get to do that through practice. And in that environment where it's just, an instructor, delivering to a crowd, we don't have those same opportunities. I think that's a lot of the value of the program. That's why I refer as many people as I can into it. So,
yeah. So if you're listening and you're like, okay, I'm a leader in an organization. What does this, grad school program have to do with me? I think these principles, Chris and I have both had quite a bit of success taking those back before we formed Purpose and Performance Group into the jobs that we were in. But then also, now consulting as well. So I think team-based learning, I think receiving feedback, asking for feedback as a leader, all of the things that Chris ran through, putting ourselves in situations where we as leaders are creating flow state for our participants, for our team members. So that means we're controlling the level of skill. We're either upskilling them if the challenge is really big, or if they have a lot of skill already, we're cranking the challenge up to put them in that state of maximum activation. Those are all things that I believe every leader can derive value from. And do you have to get your master's degree, in this program to do that? No. But you are responsible for figuring out how you're going to get those skills in some way. And so whether it's a place like the Odine program, or it's your reading, or it's some other program or a development program that you're in, I think leaders need to take responsibility for how am I going to grow? How am I going to advance? How am I going to add these skills?
Well, and I think that's a great segue into saying these types of activities, when a leader does these things, when a leader has these expectations, when we are consistently asking for, receiving, and actioning feedback, it creates a climate for that team to exist in. It creates a climate for us as students to exist in within Odine. But I think that's a pretty good segue into what is that? How does climate and culture play together? And what are those things? And, I get a little over my skis when we get too deep into socio-moral climate, but I know, Luke, this is something you dove way deep in. I'm service profit chain guy. You spent way more time with socio-moral climate. Speak to that in maybe how leaders experience that, and then specifically like what Dr. Steinheider's research and what, some key learnings are that exist there.
Yeah. So let me just outline real quick. I mean, we wanted to spend time on this because this is an area of research for you that you are, if not the one of the, you can tell me which it is, if you are the preeminent expert in the world.
No, I'm not.
But one of the, right? You're a handful of folks who has spent a lot of time really researching this concept of socio-moral climate. So climate is the psychological atmosphere of an organization. And I think for me, as I learned the word climate, the word like that term, it was helpful for me. Like knowing terms and knowing what things are is helpful. And I think a lot of folks throw around culture.
Yeah.
Oh, the culture here is this, the culture here is that. Well, I mean, if you want to use the word culture accurately, that also includes all the artifacts and the space that you're in and the knowledge management systems that you use, any other systems, right? Those are all pieces of culture. Culture is a very hard thing if you want to be accurate in your words to change in an intentional way. Mm-hmm. You might affect it, you might influence culture, but doing it in a way that's measurable is very difficult, and it's difficult to measure. For me, when I break out the piece of culture that is the psychological atmosphere of an organization, that's something that leaders can address with intention and can see outcomes. And when we pull that out and say, okay, what is the climate of this organization? We're much closer to having a pathway to what intervention makes sense to make this a high performance climate. So I'll stop talking because I'm curious from the expert. So tell us about this particular measure of climate, which is socio-moral climate. What is it? And what have you found to be, let's start with the outcomes or the performance measures that are correlated with high levels of socio-moral climate.
Mm-hmm. So first of all, the difference between climate and culture is, so culture, very difficult to change. So that's number one. And it's something what we sense whenever we go into any kind of like organization, but that are also then the deep sitting beliefs. And basically, I mean, it's kind of more through stories and the artifacts that you can really try to grasp it. But I mean, you cannot really measure it. So that's the other thing. Whereas climate then, that is about the policies and procedures. So it's much more a behavior-based construct. So which makes it then, of course, much more interesting than also for us as psychologists, as consultants, because when we change behavior, we change also then the climate. So, and it's interesting also that you call it atmosphere, because this is also, what Lawrence Kohlberg called it, when he started that research by experimenting in schools, in New York in the 60s, 70s. So, but climate is then more the kind of like term which is then used. Mm-hmm. So it's, you asked about the outcomes?
Yeah. So what is socio-moral climate? If you were just going to say, it's a climate where you feel this, where people behave in what way. Mm-hmm. And then, what are the outcomes?
Okay, it's a climate, for example, if there are disagreements and conflicts among members of the organization, they openly address it. They don't kind of like push it underneath the rug. So it's a climate also where you can question your principles and change them if they're outdated. So it's a climate, where the organization cares, about the individual and appreciates also the individual. It's a climate also which assigns responsibilities, but trains also then employees according to these responsibilities and holds them also accountable for that. And finally, it's a climate also then, where there's concern for each individual and their perspective on issues so that those can be discussed.
And what do you find whenever those elements of the climate exist? What do you find as far as, I don't know, how you want to measure performance, profitability, retention of talent, any other measures that have been correlated?
So we looked more at other more psychological constructs, but we know that these are then correlated, with financial success. So for example, employee engagement. So positive social moral climate is also then strongly predictive then of employee engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And we know then that has positive performance outcomes. So in organizations with a strong social moral climate also, employees show more pro-social behavior within the organization. So this is also organizational citizenship behavior, kind of like taking on duties, which are outside of your job description, but also outside of the organization, within the community. People are more willing to share their knowledge, which also then leads to financial success.
Mm-hmm.
They show less cynicism, so and more kind of like counterproductive work behaviors, which is positive also. And they less want to leave the organization.
Yeah.
So,
but also, they have a stronger sense of belonging, which is important.
And what relationships or personalities is it that mediates the climate? Like what creates those outcomes?
It's the behaviors, more or less, I described. So how an organization handles conflict, for example, how do they allow open communication, and also then how much are employees involved in decision-making within the organization. Mm-hmm. And another strong predictor is also then servant leadership. So leadership style, which really focuses on developing employees.
Right. And I think that's, pulling that out a little bit. Obviously we work a lot in service and hospitality. I think from senior leaders, or any leader that has a direct report or leads a team, whatever behavior we're exhibiting, we have to give it first in order to create the climate for that to exist. Mm-hmm. So it's one thing to say, well, here's the standard and use words, but we have to live that standard and actually be in service to the people around us in order to affect the climate. Mm-hmm. And that's maybe why how we communicate, the mediums that we use to communicate, and how frequently we communicate with all the employees of the organization, maybe that's why that matters. How we execute performance management and how intentional is that conversation, maybe that's why that matters. Corrective action, as you mentioned, right? Progressive discipline. How intentional are we, and what is our care level as we initiate and execute that process? Same thing with recognition. As we ratchet up intentionality around all of these practices within an organization, those behaviors spin up a better climate for people to show up in safely, give of themselves. If they see people around them serving first and receiving second, then that is the behavior that creates the climate for culture to emerge. But it's almost as if there's no detail too small when it comes to people practices. But I know one of the things, that you're big on is asking the people in the organization, what is their sentiment around these things? How do they feel? What are some best practices to figure that out? If there's a leader listening today and they want to know, I wonder what our climate is, what's a good way to find out?
Oh, there's a survey for that. Like in psychology, we always have a survey, and it has only 21 items. And it has reliability and validity. So, it's a good service, and that gives kind of feedbacks, then gives you a snapshot, of the climate within your organization. And I think what's also really important is not only to be a model as a leader, but also then have transparency. Mm-hmm. For example, when you talked about, that I ask for feedback at the end of each weekend. So I type everything up, it's anonymous, and then I hand it out to the students. Mm-hmm. So, and this so that everybody sees their comments back there, and I respond to everything. So I don't have to agree necessarily, but if I agree with it, yes, of course I make the change. Yeah. And very often I see then, that companies collect a lot of data, but they don't kind of present them back to their employees, right. And I think nothing worse can be done because, that really then diminishes engagement.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on that because it is very harmful to ask the question, and not say, here's evidence that I heard you.
Mhm.
So in one of your classes, you say, hey, tell me what can be better. You then say, here's what everybody said could be better. And here's what I can action. And here's what I can't. And, confirming, hey, everyone that's part of this experience, you're seen, heard, and understood. You're valued. And I hear you. And, in organizations, we asked the questions. We did, we start talking about a survey, right? In 21 questions, I no longer have to wonder what this climate is. But a lot of times people say, climate's great. It's great, right?
Yeah.
Everything's great. You're great. I'm great. We're great. Business is great. But in 21 questions, we can know for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why there's always value in closing the gap between what businesses do and what science knows. Science knows in 21 questions, we don't have to wonder. But it's just accepting that we can use that as value in an enterprise environment.
Yeah. And I want to give a couple just case studies. So to take this practice and make it really actionable for anyone listening. So we have a couple clients who really take this feedback thing seriously, and they've made it part of their cadence. Whether it is, I'm going to give two scenarios. There's several organizations that will do a monthly or quarterly all hands meeting. They make sure at the end of that meeting that there is a survey. What's great? What's not great? What ideas do you have? If you are the senior leader of this organization, what's the one thing that you would do differently? And then at the next month or the next quarter, right? Those things are what kick off the meeting. They're up on a slide. We're talking through them. Here's what we heard. Here's what we were able to do. Great example. We did this in one organization early this last summer. One of the things that came up multiple places is that they had the mother's room, the breastfeeding room for their organization was a repurposed restroom. And folks said, it's a little gross to have a toilet in here while I'm pumping or while I'm breastfeeding. And so over the course of about 6 weeks between that meeting when they got that feedback and the next meeting, that was remodeled. It's not hard. You pull the toilet out, you put some new finishes on, maybe put a chair in there instead, right? And we're able to come back and say, we heard you, here's what we did. Now, there were other things that they couldn't do, right? But that's one example of how you can do this. Another is, we've got another organization that they have a all the time live, almost like comment box, virtual comment box, where people can put in suggestions, questions, whatever. And they, as a senior leadership team, they take everything out of that digital box, respond to every item in there, and send out a company-wide, every employee email with every question and their response to it. Now, they're probably at the point where I'd say 70, 80% of what they get, they can't action in real time, or it's something that there's a valid reason, or it's just answering a simple question. Hey, here's who you go to get that need met. But the fact that that's a practice and a habit has immense value. I was on a call just the other day, so I'm going to flip side. Where do we not see this happening? I was on a call with someone the other day, and one of the issues that they'd been having was lots of feedback. So they did an employee survey, a lot of feedback, a big theme about we don't know what the vision is. We don't know where leadership is going. And this is a publicly traded company. And I was talking to one of the members of their senior leadership team, and they were like, I've got it. We were looking at it in our meeting. We were looking at all these slides, all these goals, all these metrics, right? And he's like, I can't. Like, the rules are, I can't share this with people. So we asked this question. People gave us an answer on what they need is that they don't get the information they need to do their job about where we're going. But here I am seeing that need, but having some sort of organizational constraint, whether that's from legal or whether that's from the finance department, whoever it is, right? Saying, no, that's not something we're comfortable actually answering that question with. And so now I'll tell you guys what I told him, which is, man, put it on the website, make it a PDF and ship it out to all your competitors. They can't execute on your plan. There's zero risk there, right? Any risk might be a granular competitive pricing response that someone makes. I think they're durable enough that none of those are actual risks. They're all just perceived risk. But they're at a point where the organization is having trouble making that decision. So yeah, just a couple real life examples, I think, as we hear these best practices from Dr. Steinheider. Okay, how do we actually put them in practice?
I think one of our other favorite topics, and I think we're going to touch on this a little bit more in our next episode, is like team versus group. I know, let's spend just a minute like diving into that, because boy, once you understand that, it's a game breaker. So when you look at this group of people that have assembled in front of you, when do you know it's a team and when do you know it's a group?
I mean, the two very decisive or distinguishing factors are really, do they have a shared goal, number one, and are they interdependent also in accomplishing this goal? And I think then one of the biggest problems I had, when I was working as a Fraunhofer, I mean, we were very much team-based, but it was really only team in name only. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, there was no real interdependence. So that was kind of like the problem with it, and we did not make actually also then the best use of the diversity of our expertise and knowledge. So this is then also why I started then looking into that, So basically, what do we need to know from each other, so that we can work with each other in a meaningful way, and also then really capitalize on our differences and not get kind of like hung up then in conflict. And that is the issue. And so just the class I taught, I mean, both of the teams had conflict within their teams, And I mean, I think that's a good learning experience also. But I mean, it's kind of like how you use it then and how you overcome then the conflict, and kind of like put together then as a team.
Yeah. The
easy way is really kind of like just dividing it. Everybody does their piece, and then you kind of like put it together. But I mean, it will not be the best probably.
Right. And so as I kind of break that idea down, it is this idea of what are we forging around? Like, what is the shared purpose that's going to bind this team together? And then allowing the people on this team to work together to figure it out. Like how do all these personalities and all these skill sets bring value and competency towards a solution? And that's opposed to ineffective leaders who call their groups teams, but they're actually in the middle. The shared purpose is serving the leader, and the leader is actually the thing that people are standing around. There's not a shared purpose in the middle of this forged team. It's a shared person. And that person has individual relationships, keeping them in their lanes. And that is not a team. Although we hear that situation called a team, it's really ineffective leadership and something that constrains business performance. So I just think it's really mission critical to get that language right. And as leaders, know when we're looking at a group where there's divide and conquer and we're transacting, and know when we're looking at a team, when that leader doesn't have to be in the middle of the circle, they're rallied around purpose and they're leveraging each other's competencies.
Yeah. It just reminds me of an organization we worked with where we implemented, and it was relatively small. They had about 50 employees, but we implemented a 360 eval for everyone every year. And guess who didn't like that?
As a leader?
Well, the groups in the organization, the functions that liked doing their own thing, right? So the folks who do not want to be interdependent, who want to succeed or fail on their own without having to consider the needs of the rest of the organization and a larger vision of success, they do not like being measured or being judged on collaboration and knowledge sharing, right? They're the same folks that you say, well, I went to go to my office the other day and everything was moved because, I'm going to change this up. It was not an IT department, but let's just say it was IT, right? We're running new network cables. Well, I had a meeting scheduled in there. Well, sorry, we just have to do it now because this is when the equipment came. We were trying to do it earlier. Like, well, I didn't know any of that, right? Well, that department who's like I don't think I should have to tell you anything. I should just be able to do my job. Fundamentally, they believe that their success is not measured by are meetings done effectively? Do people have access to their offices? Their success is, did I get project X done on time? Right. And so changing those definitions of what success is, which I think the Odine program, right, being team-based, knowing that you're going to present together in front of a jury, success is a great presentation, great feedback, a great score, and you've learned something, right? It's not, well, I read everything. I wrote a really good paper, right? I didn't have any misspellings in my paper, right? And so I should be successful. I made it to class on time. Right. So it's changing that definition of success to be much more community-based.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's sometimes, I mean, students find that difficult in the beginning because, I mean, most of our students, are high achievers, kind of like really more the kind of like type A personality. So, and most of them have not had so good experiences with teams. And so on, I see it then as our job, to kind of convince them, that if teams are set up in a good way, then they can be very beneficial and to make everybody also then a better team player.
Well, I love the flipping it on its head from, I'm going to use some terms here that maybe we wouldn't use in every day, but I'll just nerd it out a little bit. So if I'm that type A leader and I'm like, well, I'm concerned about someone social loafing on my team, I love the approach of saying, okay, well, that's your assignment to fix that. If that's what your concern is, your assignment is not to write a great paper. It's to address social loafing and have a high performing team. And that's a much different assignment than I'm going to read a chapter and I'm going to know the content, although you got to do that too. So yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I incentivize also students, because the majority of their score is then really based on the team component. So they really get more evaluated, on the basis of their teamwork than the individual work. I mean, they can decide about it before. So, I mean, it's agreed upon. But I mean, that motivates them, of course, also then, to do. To make the team
familiar.
Really work.
Right.
I'm thinking back to this team with the difficult person. And I'm like, well, I can't piss them off too much.
It wasn't me, by the way.
Because they're
just
scoring.
let everybody know. Like it wasn't me. It was somebody else.
I have to somehow get this person to perform and them rate me well on their feedback form that they're filling out that contributes to my grade.
Yeah.
Pretty great leadership experience.
Yeah. And, for me, man, in the traditional environments, and I think there's a correlation to work here. When it's just on me, I have a lot of agency over how much effort I put forward. When you put me on a team or you forge me into a team, I lose some of that agency, right? Like there's 10 reasons why I should give discretionary effort, and there's an expense to being the loafer. And yeah, I think there's some function of, hey, you know what? I really don't care if I get a B. Versus like, I care if our team, I do care a lot how our team performs, right?
Yeah.
But like individually, like if I learn it and, I choose to do something else during finals week, right? But when the team gets involved, it elevates my sense of obligation, community, just agency is increased. Like, what can I do here? A lot of good stuff.
And part of the reason why we teach that way is also because, in organization, you never make any change all by yourself. I mean, you always need to convince others, you're always part of a team and so on. That's then also the reason, why we focus so much on that.
Yeah. All right. Well, I know we have just a few minutes left. You had a pretty hot take on what's going on right now in news around the world of work and organizational psychology. So, because before we hit record, we were talking about what trends, do we see coming up? And you made a comment, something like, well, it's all the same things that have always been the things. So let me ask it again while we're recording, like what trends do you see on the horizon for that leaders and organizations are dealing with? And is it all the same that we've seen in the past? Is there anything novel? What's your take?
I think COVID really had made a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I mean, so what the students are discussing at the moment is this quiet quitting,
mm-hmm.
which just means they don't really quit, So, but employees just perform their job duties and nothing else on top of it. And so there were also some questions about, is there kind of like a difference between generations, with baby boomers always being the highest motivated, and then Generation Z also having then different concerns. But I mean, according to the data, I said, basically it's for all the same.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that can have a couple of reasons for that, So number one, everybody is maybe still exhausted, from COVID.
Mm-hmm.
I think also the way how organizations handled COVID was very differently. There's concerns about in some organizations, that employees felt micromanaged, etc. So that, of course, then doesn't increase then engagement. And if engagement is not so high, then probably they will not do, the extra work. Another reason might also be equity concerns, with inflation being so high, and then cost of living adjustments cannot meet that, so that might be a reason. But maybe it's also that, the boundaries between work and life were really blurry during COVID.
Yeah.
And so maybe then this is kind of like, fighting back, for the private life.
That's elasticity, maybe just snapping back, but
I have a very unresearched theory, so I'm going to throw it out there and see what you think.
Since I haven't seen any research on that except for this one.
So, when we think about the spectrum of transactional work versus transformational work, or we'll say by transactional, I mean, I exchange my hours for your money. Right. And I do the things that you want me to do, and you pay me for that time that I've given you or that effort. And by transformational, what I mean is I choose to grow as a person within this work community. And I'm here to develop, to grow, to contribute to something where we're bound by some sort of shared purpose. So shared purpose in transformational setting, I think, is something around making the world a better place. Shared purpose in the transactional setting, I think, is more around our purpose is to provide for ourselves or our families, whatever it is outside of work, not the organization. And so my guess, and this is just a hunch, is that there was some kind of bell curve along that spectrum. A lot of organizations kind of in the middle, they have to maximize their margin and maximize profit. And so there's some transactional forces at play. But it's like, oh, we need to have a mission statement on the wall. And, we treat each other nice here. And so there's some sort of transformational things at play too. But my gut, my intuition tells me that big group of folks in the middle that kind of have a little bit of both ends of the spectrum, that there's actually going to be kind of a bifurcation of organizations as we get more clear on what is the shared purpose of the organization. People who are quiet quitting right now would probably be very well served to be in a space where all that's expected of them is that trading hours for dollars, right? If you're going to track my mouse movements and every 10 minutes you're going to take a snapshot of my screen, why would I ever work extra? Right? You're telling me this is a transactional game, that we're trading me being active for dollars. And then on this other side, I think people who are like, I want to be a part of community. I see problems in this world that I want to address. I think a fulfilling work community is part of that. I want to transform as a person. I want to advance emotionally, cognitively, physically. I'm on a journey in all of those domains, and my work experience is a part of that. My personal life can't be divorced from my work life. There is some level of interconnectedness there, and my dog might show up in my office, or my kid might show up on my video or in the background of a phone call, right? So I feel like, there's this bifurcation as people get more clarity about what they want and also what organizations offer. So I don't know. I'm curious your take.
Oh, that's very much in line with what I said. So, because that goes back to this micromanaging, this kind of like control, and punishment more or less, So, companies also ordering then the employees back to the office, no matter whether it's necessary or not.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas then other companies, during COVID, for example, who made sure then that employees had the equipment they needed, who made sure that there still was a sense of community, and who kind of like really facilitated that. And who let also employees, choose whether they want to work from home and not.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those companies, they have probably higher engagement. I've seen it in my own family. Whereas then the other ones probably, they have then probably more than the employees, who do then this quiet quitting
mm-hmm.
or maybe even leaving altogether.
Yeah. And how much of it, Chris, I'm curious for you, since you're a service industry, our heavy hitter from service industry, how much of it is, if I'm competing on a product and its price placement in the market, if I have a better toaster, can I afford the leaky engagement and just have a transactional culture versus if I'm Hilton,
mm-hmm.
right? To some degree, my culture is my brand because people experience that every time they talk to someone, at the front desk or cleaning their room or in a restaurant. So yeah, what's your take on that?
Well, specifically to service industry, there's a way to hide hickeys, right? Like add more value to the club, and that hides service breakdowns, right? So if I can give you more monetary value as a customer, if I know my service value is slipping, and I look at this labor market and say, there's no way. Like there's simply no way based on the model, the financial model our business is on, that we're going to be able to plug the holes in the timeline we need to plug them, then I can program or promote additional value to loyalty clubs in order to overcome those service or personnel breakdowns. So that's one thing. Now, is that preferred? No, because it's hard to go back the other way. And I don't want to answer a question with a question, but I would be very interested in Dr. Steinheider's take on this, because this is what it feels like. We're missing people, right? Take Oklahoma City, for instance, 2.5% or 2.3% unemployment. There's everybody's got a job. So you have to have some sort of differentiation. And in service environments, there's typically a lot of low and medium wage jobs. And those are very difficult to fill right now. And the more that those are vacated, the more pressure gets pushed onto the rest of the team. The more working managers and working directors you have, the less time there is to actually do the people engagement and leadership, and the whole system. It just starts to slide a little bit, right? The system wants to fall apart as people defect from it. As the community weakens, it creates pressures elsewhere in the system that really damage that. And if it feels anything like stability as a senior leader, I don't know how hard to push. I don't know when can I pretend like it's not COVID anymore. When can I declare it over? It's like, man, I know we're having these service breakdowns, but I don't know how hard to push. I can't afford to lose anyone else because there's no one to take their place, and the team's already stressed, and the people keep coming.
Mm-hmm.
The customers keep coming. I'm a senior leader in this spot. Help me orient. What should I do? What are the questions I should be trying to answer? And does any of this play? How does climate play? How does engagement play? How does equity play? Speak into that for a moment.
So engagement is a dependent variable, so that's the outcome. So basically, you have to step back and a little bit, and think about what influences engagement. And the first thing what I would say is, it's a climate, the organizational climate. Mm-hmm. So because that is really how you can differentiate yourself as an employer. because, employees often, they just leave, also a culture behind them, a climate. So on the other hand, if the climate is very positive and they feel like, that they're part of the family, you don't want to walk out on that, especially not because you don't know what the next job will be like.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm interested to see is like, I'm very hopeful that the nucleus of these teams that see COVID through to post-pandemic and then like whatever the next season of business is, that like they're forged tighter than ever and that those organizations are set up for really healthy and sustainable long-term success. Kind of going back to your question, Luke, I think what I have to do is say, can I look at the problem and not action it? Or do my values say this team steps up and we figure it out? We've got personnel gaps, but we figure out how to automate. We figure out where to find the people. We do better referral programs. We improve our climate. Like, is my value to sit here and look at the problem, or is my value to action the problem? And it's that value, like that me showing up in that way establishes, like that behavior from me establishes an expectation within the organization that produces the climate. It's that value congruence piece of engagement that ultimately a senior leader has to determine for themselves.
Yeah. And I know you're saying from a, what do I believe? Do I believe I have to respond and act? I'll just say from an economic standpoint, do I believe that any of these trends are going to change? Do I believe that people are going to, in general, have clearer expectations about what they want from work? And a lot of the population have rising expectations about what they want from work. Do I believe that we're going to so significantly change our birth rate and our immigration policies that we're not going to have more worker shortage 10 years from now than we have now? And if you're willing to bet on those things, like, sure, do nothing. Or you can say, I'm going to be 5% less profitable for 2 years while I build an internal capacity and competency around our culture in this organization.
Right. Absolutely.
And I would always, also ask employees, for their feedbacks, their suggestions and so on, because that really makes a difference, because otherwise as a leader, you don't know about everything what can be done, and kind of really harness and all these suggestions. And also it gives then the employee more ownership, which we know then is a positive, and keeps them in the organization.
You bet.
Yeah. And that's what we're looking for, is those win-wins or win-win-wins, all the 2-for-1s, 3-for-1s out there. When I ask for feedback, I'm getting insight that I don't have. That's a win. And I'm giving people the feeling that they have a voice. They're able to participate in the direction and priorities of this organization. And we know that's an antecedent to engagement. So that's a win as well. So yeah, why not? And if we can find those win-wins, 2 or 3, right? And just add 2 or 3 every couple months. If you're going to start somewhere, do that. And if you don't know what those win-wins are, like, call us.
You bet. And, one, I appreciate so much, Dr. Steinheider, your vision, your effort, and everything you've given to the ODINE program at the University of Oklahoma. But I know there's probably some folks out there listening to this today and be like, okay, source code. Right? How do I tap into this? So can you share with people, like, where can they go to learn more about the Organizational Dynamics program?
Just type in ODYN and OU Tulsa.
Okay. And we'll get everything we need to know.
Okay.
And careful, because it happens really fast. I think, we met on a Tuesday. I was in class by Friday, something like that. So, wow. But I would really, if you're a leader out there and you have people on your team, and they're ready to take that next step, or maybe you're ready to take that next step and move from that airport reader to empirical research. It's an awesome program, T-based learning. I don't know how I would ever give more back than what I received, but I promise to try. So thank you.
Yeah.
Luke, last shot.
Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you.
Transformative experience in my life. So I'm forever grateful as well. I would say if you're listening to this, go check out Odine Program and Dr. Steinheider. If we can help you in any way, reach out, purposeandperformancegroup.com, or you can find us on most social channels.
All right. Thank you guys both for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
And until next time, thank you all.
Magic in the Room is hosted by Chris Province, Hannah Bratteroo, and Luke Freeman, and produced by Ben West. Theme music is by Evan Grimm. Title track Fake Love, available on Apple Music. And this podcast was recorded at Storycatcher Studio with video and audio editing and production support by Brad O'Hara and Alicia Crum, with inspiration, strategy and technical support by yours truly, Neil Hughes. Magic in the Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. You can find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com, and remember, previous episodes are available at magicintheroom.com.